Welcome back. Notwithstanding all the crazy news that's going on in the world right now, I think it's important to take a few minutes just to talk about some of the things that might impact gas markets and LNG markets, since energy security seems to be increasingly important. So let's talk about energy security and let's talk about the weaponization of natural gas. This is a real concern that we have now seen in the last few years. I think we can start off by talking about over the last decade, Russia has in a number of times threatened to use Ukrainian gas transported to Europe via Ukraine as weapons against Ukraine to punish them, to try to extract more value, try to get better prices, whatever the case might be. And we have seen them do this, and they usually do this in the middle of the winter when the Ukrainians are most likely to suffer. So this is obviously a concern because we like to think that contracts, commercial contracts, once they're signed, will be honored no matter what the politics happen to be. Well, Russia has shown in the past that they are quite happy to use gas as a weapon. And of course, last year, once the war had started, the war, maybe one can argue, had a lot to do with natural gas transits to Ukraine. But now, once the war did start, we saw the Nord Stream pipeline blown up. It's still not clear who did it. I really don't know. It seems hard to understand which side benefits the most by the the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipe. But either way, the Nord Stream pipe got blown up. And then just last week or 2 weeks ago, we saw the Finland Estonia pipe get blown up. Suddenly the Baltics are becoming like a war zone with gas pipelines and other infrastructure. I think in the Finnish Estonia pipe there was also some other uh, the communications or the electrical connections also were impacted by that violent act. We design gas pipelines and gas infrastructure to safely operate. We don't design these things to withstand terrorism or withstand military attack. A lot of these pipelines are just sitting on the seabed. A lot of them are not very deep at all. We're talking about 50 meters or even less. Stuff that me as a scuba diver could go down there and easily see and do damage if that's what I wanted to do. And the fact that these pipelines are now considered fair game by whichever party that feels that they want to have an advantage politically or economically to do this, it suddenly changes how pipelines get built around the world. And this is a big concern because pipelines are already very expensive. You now need to start defending them against terrorism and or acts of the state. This is a concern. So far we've been lucky. We haven't seen this in the LNG trade. We haven't seen real destruction or sabotage of LNG facilities. I hope it never happens, but you can imagine that we have seen in the past oil tankers being targeted for various things. And if the war that's currently going on in the Middle East does spread, there's a lot of LNG tankers that are passing through the seas, the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Suez Canal, the Eastern Med. They become quite tempting targets, and we would really really hate to see if LNG facilities or LNG tankers suddenly become targets for some kind of a terrorist act. I don't think this is beyond the realm of possibility. We are seeing more and more LNG trade dominated by state owned enterprises. We have seen, obviously, the Qataris are a big exporter. Abu Dhabi wants to be a larger exporter. The Russians are still exporting a lot of LNG. These are all state players. And if someone has something against the state, whether that's another state that has something against that state or some other group or entity, then those targets become quite tempting for them. So I guess my concern is we have seen now that gas pipelines can easily become targets. I hope we don't see that LNG infrastructure does the same because it'll be a very slippery slope if that starts happening. So let's just talk a little bit more about energy security. Actually, in general, I think there has been with this war, there's been a realization that a lot of the LNG and a lot of the gas comes, and even a lot of the oil comes from still a very volatile part of the world that has no solution. If the war does spread, which of course we all hope it doesn't, but it's not going to end. It doesn't look like the war is ending anytime soon. And if the war does spread, then I'm very, very concerned about what that means for markets. We'll obviously see a massive spike in spot prices. Insurance rates might go up. If Iran starts becoming a target of Israeli missiles or vice versa, and things start crossing over the Gulf, then it's Qatar is kind of on that way, and that's very, very dangerous for the world LNG markets. So let's hope the war doesn't spread, but the implications of the war are already impacting some gas shipments. We have seen the Israelis now stop their own pipeline gas going to Egypt, which is going to go to Egypt to then be sent to the Egyptian terminals and then be exported. We have seen those supplies being curtailed. I'm really thinking that any further cooperation in the Eastern Med is going to be a little bit at risk. We saw that Abu Dhabi with BP took a major stake in some of the offshore Israeli gas fields. I think the UAE is playing a very fine line between friend or foe of Israel right now, but it'll be very, very hard to justify, I think, for a state-owned enterprise like Abu Dhabi National Company, a national oil company, to start publicly investing a lot of money that'll support the Israeli economy, for instance. At least it cannot happen in the near term. So this war will have implications on some of the stuff that was we expected to happen in the Eastern Med. Pipelines out of the Eastern Med. It's still very, very unclear how that ever going to happen and how it's going to happen. We saw that the exploration that was done on the Israeli Lebanese joint zone that didn't go very well. I think it was a dry hole, dry well, but there's still expectation that some of the Cypriot gas will end up going to Egypt and then being exported from there. Everything I think is up in the air. It's very hard to get into international public-private companies to invest into a part of the world that is potentially quite volatile. We have seen that pipeline projects in different parts of the world actually get canceled because of politics. For those of us who can remember, there was the Iranian pipeline proposed to India. It had to transverse Pakistan. Yeah, because of the India-Pakistan relationship, that pipeline never went ahead. There's always talk about a Turkmenistan pipeline exporting to India and Pakistan, but had to go through Afghanistan, so that never really went ahead. There's other cases around the world. We have seen the pipeline from Azerbaijan going to Turkey, the BTC pipeline, that had to avoid Armenia for political reasons. So we already seen that gas pipelines can be victims or can have be impacted by politics. I think the rule of thumb we used to say that every time you cross an international border with a pipeline, your complexity goes up by at least tenfold. Well, unfortunately, now with acts of terrorism, pipelines being blown up, it's not just crossing the other country on shore, it's also the offshore that is at risk. So these are all trends that I think we should continue watching with a bit of concern. I think another thing that's happened in the last couple of weeks was kind of a growing realization that gas supply, LNG supply, is really going to be a problem. We have kidded ourselves to say that, oh, we have hit peak oil and peak gas, and we're now into renewables, and we shouldn't invest in oil and gas, especially after the IEA report a couple of years ago. Well, I think that the hard truth is coming out. The wind industry is really going through a tough time. I think that backlash is going to impact other renewable industries as well. There's a lot of hype around hydrogen. I just don't see how it's all going to materialize into something significant, especially because a lot of that green hydrogen was kind of dependent on getting green energy to that hydrogen plant. And that green energy was often going to come from cheap, almost free wind. Well, if the wind industry suffers, green hydrogen industry suffers as well. We really have to think about where this gas supply is going to come from. We saw the CEO, I think, or president of Mitsui, one of the largest Japanese LNG trading companies, talk about the fact that we need more LNG investment. We have seen the Middle East, go ahead with large domestic gas projects that were previously thought unfeasible. The sour gas fields in Abu Dhabi, some of the offshore fields in Saudi, etc. They now look like going ahead just to add to that supply around the world. And then we saw people like big companies like Exxon that bought Pioneer. just kind of stepping back here, I would like I often tell people some of the most significant things that happened in the industry since I've been in the industry for 35 years was the growth of American shale gas. Well, now that shale gas was actually developed completely and totally by independent oil and gas companies in the US. The super majors, Exxon, Chevron, Conoco's, Shells, had almost nothing to do with the shale gas industry. Well, I think they've now realized, maybe 20, 30 years too late, that the shale gas industry, the shale gas, offers some of the best places to get reserve additions, to grow your production quickly with actually very low risk. And now we've seen companies like Exxon go out and buy Pioneer. I think the floodgates are opening. We're going to see a lot more M&A activity happening in the American shale gas patch, especially because over the last few years, the independents have really been beat up because they spent a lot of their investment on developing the reserves, and they were not very good about actually improving the share price at the same time. So these companies are relatively cheap with the amount of reserves there is. And the super majors like Exxon and Conoco are realizing the fastest way to grow their reserves is actually just buy up these companies instead of trying to drill exploration wells in very difficult parts of the world, and which have a long, long time between discovery and production. When in the States, you could potentially drill a couple of wells. They're not true exploration. They're typically a step outs. The exploration risk or the development risk is very low, and you can bring these things into production extremely quickly. So Exxon, I think, has now a few years ago it bought XTO. Now it buys Pioneer. I think there'll be a few more mergers happening, but it tells me that it's all about the gas supply, and we don't have enough gas supply, and we have to continue investing in gas supply. In the US, that gas supply often goes into LNG plants, so we need to invest in LNG plants because the LNG plants then provide energy to the world. And the US LNG plants are not controlled by the state. They're not owned by any state. They're private companies, private investments, and hopefully they wouldn't be as much targeted by entities that may have something against the particular state. So I think that makes a very strong case for U.S. LNG. If spot prices go up because of the war expanding in the Middle East, hopefully that would not change American local gas prices much. It shouldn't. And so long-term contracts out of the U.S. should still be good, even though people who bought oil-linked contracts out of Qatar will probably feel the impact in that oil-linked over a few months as the oil-linked prices come through. So let's just see what happens. I think I want to end with another craziness out of the IEA. I mean, the IEA, to me, I had so much respect for that organization, and I'm kind of blown away at what a grave it's digging for itself. It seems to have kind of lost the plot, as they say. A few years ago, it said we should stop investing in oil and gas. I'm glad that a lot of the companies didn't pay attention to that and continue to invest in oil and gas. But unfortunately, a lot of entities, a lot of banks, a lot of stakeholders demanded that investors and investment funds stop investing in oil and gas. I think we are suffering for that because these very short-sighted statements by the IEA, I think, are really, really going to hurt the world, especially the world's poor. But what came out this week kind of cracks me up. The IEA has said that we need 80 million kilometers of new electrical grid to transmit power from all this green power that we're going to build. I think it's still not easy, but relatively easier to build a windmill farm or a solar farm. It's very, very hard to actually connect it to the gas grid because often where the wind is and where the solar power is not where the existing grids are. So the existing grids are connecting existing power plants to existing markets. The wind resources happen to be in the middle of nowhere. They have to build brand new electrical lines. The Economist ran a cover story about this a few months ago, but the IEA came out this week, said we need 80 million kilometers. That is almost, I think they said it's double the existing worldwide electrical grid network. And they need this to happen by 2040, which is 17 years away. We need to double the world's electrical grid. We know that electrical grids are incredibly hard to permit. These things, no one wants a massive high-end electrical line running through their yard, through the backyard, through the farmland, whatever the case might be. And they take a lot of materials and they take a lot of effort to build. Oftentimes they have to be very, very long. And they cost a lot of money. So who's going to build all these electrical grids? the IEA really should look at itself closely and saying, oh, on one hand, they say stop investing in oil and gas, where we have the infrastructure to bring that energy to the market, and yet we should invest in renewables instead. But by the way, to get the renewables to the electricity energy to the market, we need 80 million kilometers. Just to put things in perspective, India, which has gone through this massive electrification, probably the one of the world's biggest electrification after China in the last decade, only built like 15 to 20,000 kilometers a year, which is still massive. We're talking about 80 million kilometers of new or upgraded electrical grid has to be built between now and 2040, according to the IEA. So I guess the message is don't listen to the IEA when they tell you to stop investing in oil and gas, because that grid is just not going to get built. Someone has got to pay for it. I don't know which private entity or public entities can afford to do it. And you won't get the permits. It takes 5 to 15 years to get these permits to build anyway. So please don't stop investing in oil and gas, because if you are completely relying on renewables and the renewables relying on the grid that never gets built, we're all going to be sitting in the dark, in the cold, in the next decade. So, with that note, hope everybody's doing well, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.